Cool. We'll go ahead and get started. Just always, as always, super thrilled that you're here to join us today. I'm Justin Clifford. I work at Bereave, and I'll be your host today. Loss Leaders is a program really centered around how employees could, and frankly, we think should, step up when loss occurs in the lives of their employees. And the reason that we do these programs is that Bereave is on a mission to really help companies provide the absolute best possible bereavement response when their employees suffer a loss. And in that pursuit, we get to meet incredible people that can bring so much education to business leaders that are really working to build a more compassionate and empathetic workplace. So this is our effort to get them in front of you. The chat is open, as you see. Oscar, thanks for being here from Chicago, my former hometown. Love it. We're going to go to usually about 45 past the hour, and we'll get recordings out by end of the week. Recordings will be audio on Spotify, and the video and summary will be on our website. Cool. You're here for Kate, not for me. So let's get rolling with Kate. Kate is the co-founder and CEO of Opre, an AI performance review software platform for HR and managers. Kate comes with a handful of leadership roles where she learned firsthand the importance of performance reviews for employees and the impact that it can have on performance of your teammates, which is what we'll talk about today. So if you want to take a look at Opre while we're chatting, you can actually see Kate's URL in her header there. It's getopre.com. So go ahead and take a look if you'd like. But Kate, welcome to Loss Leaders.
Thank you so much for having me, Justin. It's really, I'm such a fan. And so it's awesome to get to meet you in person and chat with everyone here.
Yeah, ditto. It feels like we've known each other for a long time, but when our mutual friend and confidant, Amy Volas, says, hey, you guys need to talk on the webinar on Loss Leaders, that was just a big spark to be like, yeah, what are we doing? Why haven't we done this? It's awesome. So real quick, just to get started, can you give a bit of background of why you are building Opre?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, my last role was VP of marketing at a venture-backed startup. And it was the first time I was managing managers. It was the first time I was promoted above my peers. It was the first time I was on the executive team. It was the first time I reported to the CEO. There were all these manager firsts for me all at once. And I had never had manager training. And thank God I worked for a wonderful CEO who was like, we're going to get you trained. You're going to get an executive coach. Like thousands and thousands of dollars were invested in my leadership. And it was a transformational experience. And it made me think, why have I been leading people for 10 years prior to this without this experience? Right. It really is kind of shocking that we don't invest more early on, and it is expensive, right? Human executive coaching is really, and management training is an expensive endeavor. And we thought, I think we can do a lot with AI as a primer for that, and to make it available, to help those learnings. And it just makes the job of leadership and management so much easier when you know how to do it, right. And less stressful and more effective and all these things. And it's for leaders themselves, but also for the teams that you work with, right? How often do we think about, oh, my boss this or my manager that? And so it's just not necessary anymore. And that's the mission, right? The mission of Opre has always been, will always be, to help leaders build healthy, high-performing teams.
Yeah, I love that so much. And we talk a lot on the show. I talk a lot in general about having been in management and leadership roles for probably 15 years before I had I had a coach, right? I landed on an executive team and got a coach, very similar to you. It's like, well, where was this the previous 14 years, right? Yeah. Like I needed this because nobody really teaches you how to manage people. And we've got an advisor, Ashley Hurd, who runs a company called Manager Method that is doing something very similar in a different way than you're doing it, but really focusing on unlocking the power of managers in looking for results, right? I noticed something when I was looking at Opre's website, which other people might be looking at right now, but the word empathy comes up a lot on your website. Can you talk a little bit about what the role empathy plays in management from your perspective?
Yeah. I think it's everything. When we talk about leadership, I would say talking about what empathy is not, or it gets confused a lot with sympathy and with niceness. And I think it's neither of those things. Yes, do we want to be sympathetic when something happens, or right? But we also want to be empathetic, and that I think there's a key difference there. And so yeah, it's I would say the closest word to empathy is kindness. How can we be kind to each other and ourselves, and really do what we are here to do together? So empathy in leadership is really about understanding the person that you're leading, right? Understanding their, what makes them uniquely qualified to do the job that they're doing. What are their unique strengths? What are their blind spots? Helping to coach them through that. And then it's also, which we'll talk a lot more about today, it's also understanding the group itself, right? How does this job and the person who's doing this job fit into the group itself? How do we weigh the needs of the group with the needs of the individual? And I think that empathy, it's like next level empathy, right? It's not just person to person, but it's a whole group. And that can be really hard. I think actually when someone on a team suffers a loss, it can be, you want to be empathetic to the person, right? But you also have to be empathetic to the team and the rest of the people as well. Would love to. I need, I want to talk more with you about this,
Sure.
specifically with regards to grief, but with regards to performance, understanding and maintaining the high standard that is necessary is always good for the person and the team in the role. What is empathetic, I believe, is helping to find unique and different and fitting ways that the person who's in the role can meet that high expectation, right? And that takes a lot of reps and a lot of trying and a lot of trust between two people to try different things together to meet that standard. And that's where the empathy, I think, comes in, is really understanding, this isn't working. Doing it this way isn't working for this person. We got to do it another way to meet that high expectation.
Yeah. I'm curious, it does. It does. It was great. And I want to tie it back to kind of your first go at, leading leaders and leading a team. At what point, because I'm making the assumption here that you didn't walk into that thinking about empathy. Maybe you did. But at what point did that click that was like, hey, empathy is a really big part of all of this?
When I became a manager of managers, you realize how, before, when I was managing individual contributors and nothing to it, right? You just didn't have the experience. I was managing point to point, right? Helping this person, helping that person, helping this person. And that's really the sphere of influence I have as a manager of individual contributors. But when you become a manager of managers, you realize, this group and that group need to fit together, right? And these people need to fit together. And these managers that I'm directly managing now, they need to have the space and autonomy and understanding to lead their teams the way that they can uniquely lead them. And it's going to be different than me if I were doing it. And so it kind of it's like this extracted thing where you realize, oh my gosh, I have this point-to-point approach to management is just not working. It's not effective. And so you start to understand the impact. I'm curious for you if you had that aha moment in your career.
I mean, I have failed miserably so many times, and I think a lot of this was like a lot of learning about empathy and how it fits in has really been probably in the past probably since 2020, probably since COVID, where mostly because Lessonly, the company that I was with at the time, hired an empathy at work coach named Lisa Mertes, who's a good friend of ours. And she came in and did a training about empathy. And I was like, oh, this makes a ton of sense, not because of everything that's going on in the world, but because it just makes human sense. And it turns out even 3 years later, I took StrengthsFinder, and empathy, I think, was number 32 for me out of 34 strengths.
Yeah.
And so I started talking to Lisa more and started like developing a relationship like, hey, I need to get better at that. And the weird thing was for me is that people told me I was empathetic, but it wasn't showing up that way. And I had to really, I hired a coach actually to kind of help me like bridge the gap of like, why are people saying this? And it is still something that I have to work on. It is a skill that Lisa has taught me. It's a skill, right? So I think 2020 kind of like kicked it in, and then it's been like this really slow progress for me, right? And we work in a very empathetic, necessary world. So it has been a muscle that I've needed to really work. You asked, or you talked a lot about like managing point to point and then managing the whole. At what point does empathy show up in performance reviews in your mind?
Yeah. Well, yeah, good question. So I think, performance reviews, when we talk about performance reviews, one, they're a moment in time where there should really be no surprises in that formal setting. So I would say, drawing it back to where is there empathy in performance reviews, I think it's every day, right? It is clarity and communication about the expectation, and then a constant working together of building trust with the person you're reviewing, about how to meet that high standard, right? The changes that you're making in the work, the ways that you're trying to find new things that you can do to meet that standard, or to get faster at meeting that standard, or whatever the thing is that you want to do to get better. The empathy is in the continuous conversation. It is every day. Like I encourage leaders, there should be a conversation about performance every day, which sounds like crazy, but it is true, right? We're here to work, and to get a job done and to be human, right? I'm not saying like we should be not talking about anything else but performance, but right, performance is a really important part when we talk about what really enables employees to do well. When they work in an environment that is healthy and high performing, man, that team feels unstoppable. That employee then feels unstoppable. Like anything is possible. We can do these great things together, but it takes that continuous conversation about performance. And I think that is kind, and I think that is empathetic to talk about it, and also to get input, right? Because I don't know about you, but at least in tech, and I'm not sure about the folks on this call, but the expectation changes so much that if you're not continuously talking about it, the alignment is never going to be there, right? You're constantly swimming against a current if you're not talking about it all the time, because it changes.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, right? Like we talk to people, and just not bereaved related, but just in general conversations about work. People always talk about like, hey, had my performance review the one time of year where I find out how I'm doing, right? And I got a 1% raise, and could have had 3, but obviously didn't do well enough. But I wish I would have known, right? Like, but you're taking this like what tends to be, and sometimes at places that do it well, maybe they're doing it 90 days, right? Every 90 days.
Yeah.
But thinking about that 90 to 365, but you're talking about daily, right? What are those? Because I think people like think about when you're talking about performance, there's like a sit down and there's a document and there's a process, right? But you're talking about like these daily injections of performance discussion. Can you talk about how those kind of show up?
Yeah. Well, one, I'll say they usually don't show up because we like to avoid them a lot of the times, right? It feels like conflict to have them if you're not having them regularly, right? It takes practice, just like anything else. And I would say, so one, they don't show up because we avoid them. I believe part of the reason why we avoid them is because it feels contentious. It feels like, if you're my manager, it's Kate versus Justin. And that is not it, right? It's Kate and Justin versus the expectation. Right? It's us together versus this thing that we need to do.
Love that.
We need to do. One thing that I usually advocate for as part of manager training is negotiation training. When you learn how to negotiate really well, you learn how to create a third thing, right? It's the people versus the thing that needs to happen. And that is always like when you want to be continuous, it's really easy to have that conversation of that thing we want to go achieve together. Not the how am I doing, right? It's a different framing. Yes. Does it matter how this person is doing against the expectation? Absolutely. And a performance review is like a line in the sand of, how you did, but really it should be every single day. If you're doing it right, it's this two people against a thing rather than a person against a person. That point to point, right, doesn't really make sense. In a performance review itself, look, I think we do performance reviews. However, we do them very differently. They come monthly. You get performance feedback daily from our solution, right? To get people into the conversation about talking about performance every single day. And so, performance reviews, unfortunately, are a, when we talk about compensation, right? So you brought up compensation. So you got to get into the compensation. How do we get a raise? Right? I don't have this performance review. How do I get a raise? Right. And that's a real thing that needs to be discussed. And the way that performance reviews kind of came up, which I don't know if people know this, but they basically came out of World War II. It's the way the US Army did them, or they created this mechanism, and soldiers were used to it when they came out. And so then businesses started to adopt it. And that's kind of how it started to happen. But an organization usually does them because there's X dollars to give in promotion or raises, right? And so companies believe that they need to compare their employees against each other to figure out what is the right, who gets 3%, who gets 1%, yada, yada. And I'm not saying I have a perfect solution for that, but the performance review doesn't serve the organization really well. I would say particularly in the rating side of things. So if you're asking folks to rate, Justin is a 4, but Joe's a 5, right? It's not creating the high performance culture that you need to achieve the things you need to achieve as an organization, right? It is at its core pitting people against each other. And I don't think that's cool.
Yeah, no doubt. So and I'm you say things and like these little memories are getting triggered, and I'm feeling like a horrible manager at times, or I'm laughing at because what you are saying resonate. Like we used to pull from a pool, right? Here's the pool, right? And it got to the point where I was in charge of hiring everybody, right? And so now I'm thinking like, did I hire a 1%er versus a 3%er? Right? But I can only give 4 3%ers, and the rest has to be 1 or whatever it is. It's like this game that felt really, really, really goofy, made me second guess a lot of things, right? Took a lot of time and a lot of energy that felt like it could have been placed elsewhere. But what I'm kind of gravitating to here is this us, and I think Emily put it in the chat here, the us versus the problem, right? I used to use dashboards a little bit because I was working with sales teams, to be able to say, hey, here's what the dashboard says, right? Can we talk about this, right? But I'm feeling like Opre can kind of be that dashboard. Hey, here's what Opre told me today, right? Is Opre just off, or is Opre on, or can we talk about this? Is that kind of the way that managers could use that on a daily basis?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's like an impartial observer of performance, and it creates a little bit more objectivity. Really, I mean, the value is really just in the continuous conversation, right? It's the getting used to and comfortable with that. So that's the best part of it. The compensation part, like, look, there's if we can get people just having that continuous conversation, that's the key. The compensation stuff, I believe, follows, and you've seen some examples of companies where this works. You know, to your point, like you as a manager are stuck. You get a pool, and that's the structure. But for the HR folks on the call, right, they are the ones kind of creating, or in conjunction with, you know, finance and all the, you know, all the things that go into creating good compensation strategy. But when you think about it, right, we don't always love variable compensation, but if you pay people well, you know, for the job that they're doing, and then they have a variable or performance-based part of the compensation where the group does well, right? If the company does well or the team does well, whatever the shared vision is, right, then all of the team members get that additional pay. I think that that's the you know, the approach to making more money over time, right? Is having that, like, we can go crush it and make lots of money, but we're also getting paid fairly. We're getting cost of living increases that are the same across the board, right? That's not, you know, that's not performance compensation, right? It's not compensation for high performance. Our jobs, you know, they cost what they cost, and we get paid what we get paid. But you know, every company has a different ethos about that, and it's hard to create a really good compensation strategy. And I'll say, no company, no compensation, no compensation plan is going to make everyone feel good about it. They're gonna, someone is gonna be mad about it, and that is what, you know. That's another reason why the job of HR is incredibly hard.
Right. Yeah. Totally. I'm going to throw this question up here. Would you agree that using ratings, and I think you pretty much just answered this, but would you agree that using ratings to determine pay increases is also not ideal?
Yeah. It for so many reasons. One is it pits employees against each other. Two is it makes people feel like there is a limit to their pay, which, yes, there is at some point a limit, but I would prefer, you know, to work in a system where there is a minimum amount of pay and there is unlimited, or, you know, a huge possibility of additional pay. And the rating system, when you do a rating system, it's a closed system, right? You're saying, I get a bucket and Joe gets 3% and Sally gets 1%. For you as a manager, you don't feel good about either one of those things, you know? And the person getting it often doesn't know that they're the 1%. They think everyone was 1%, but some people were 3%. It's like, I don't know how to work in this system, but I do know the individual, so much focus on the individual performance rather than the shared performance of the group, and the continuous conversations necessary with individuals to contribute to that shared vision. You know, that's, in my opinion, that's the only way to do performance and compensation.
So let's talk about, because they are so closely linked, I'm going to back out of the comp part just for a second.
Yeah.
Maybe altogether. I don't know. We'll see where this goes. But the foundations of a great performance review, right? We're walking in. Maybe we have a doc, maybe we don't. All I know is that HR just told me I need to do a performance review every 90 days. And maybe gave me a little bit of a framework on how to do it and said, hey, you know, be creative.
Yeah.
Right. If I'm walking into that thinking like, hey, I need to do more, I need this to be a better experience because I want it to be a better experience. I understand the impact that it can have. What are some of the foundational components that I should be walking in with for that teammate?
Yeah. Look, I believe the number one golden rule of performance reviews is no surprises. You shouldn't, if something is going to be a surprise to someone, it's not something you've articulated to a direct report. I think you need to have a conversation outside of that, or you need to have like you need to work up to the performance review if that's the case, right? So if it's not, understand sometimes these things happen, but yeah, I would say no surprises is the number one foundation. Then I believe really good component of performance reviews, and sometimes managers have control over this, sometimes they don't. Either way, I would say that the most important part of this is you want to have a self-review and a manager review. So you want to be asking the same questions, right? And HR is probably telling you these are the 10 questions we want you to answer. Even if HR says, hey, manager, we just care that you write this thing and submit it. I would go above and beyond and say, hey, direct report, here's the questions. I want you to answer them first. And then I'm going to write them, and we're going to talk about where we agree on this thing and where we're not aligned, right? I should say, like, basically, where are the big differences in the answers? Because that's the space where, you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that, or those are the surprises. And without the two people taking some low pressure, not in a real conversation time to sit and think about that, that's a key foundation to a good performance review. So even if HR doesn't require it, I would say you need to do it still. And then I would say we don't do this enough. Oftentimes it's like, hey, did you meet the expectation or not? Those are the questions. Where I've seen success with teams is how you're working to achieve the expectation is where the real meat of the conversation is, right? How is this person at communication? How are they at responsiveness? These things are important conversations to have, and we don't want to tell someone they're a bad communicator, because they're probably not. It's just a misaligned expectation, right? You didn't create the third thing in that instance. And so this is performance review is an opportunity to do that. So I would say, even if the 10 questions are about, like, just did you meet the expectation or not, right? Or to what degree, you want to ask additional questions of, like, how do you feel like you worked to achieve this, or what worked about getting to this expectation or not, because that's where the meat of the good stuff is.
No doubt. I'm thinking back to some of the reviews that we used to do, and we had a few things that you're outlining, but it was like a self rating and then a manager rating, and we looked for the gaps of 2 or more, where there's a difference of 2 or more, and it was always really funny working with very high performing salespeople, and people that were very hard on each other, and the gaps usually came from them being really hard on themselves, and so a lot of the coaching ended up being around making sure on a daily or weekly or regular basis, making sure that we were kind of promoting some of those things that they were just being really hard on themselves for, right? So instead of like a skill that we had to work on, it was more of like a mindset thing that we had to work on, which became really difficult because I didn't know how to do that, except just show up when they're alive a little bit differently, as much as possible. But that delta between their rating and the manager rating became a really, really powerful tool for us to focus on what we were going to coach on for the next quarter.
So look, in that instance, I think ratings are good, right? If that's what they're used for, is that delta. They're not used for, well, Joe's a 2 and Sally's a 3, so they get take that part out of the compensation. So yes, the ratings are good for that use case. And the good conversation. And you brought up a really good point, which I think is something people forget about performance, is the highest performers are hardest on themselves, typically. And that can be just as detrimental to an organization, to the person, to the manager, if that person doesn't understand the expectation, right? You're being so hard on yourself because you don't understand that you are meeting the expectation, right? It's this constant, and that is like the number one thing that causes a high performer to leave. It's burnout. It is like the recipe for burnout.
Yeah, totally. We've got a handful of comments and questions here that I have not been monitoring well, but I think Jessica's question I'm gonna throw in here, because I think this fits a lot with the ratings and who's giving what, like peer reviews or 360 reviews. General thoughts.
I think that they can be great if organizations are expecting group performance. So like if if the goal is, you know, the marketing team drives X in demand and everyone is reviewed and compensated on that, then a peer review can be really good for helping to understand how the team is working together. In that instance, I don't believe that the manager or anyone else needs to read the review. Like, I don't think I need to see all of what a peers think. It's important that they work with each other, right? And no organization does that, or very few, right? Sometimes, especially, like, it's a mismatch, right? If you have an individual performance management system where the individual is reviewed and they're compensated on that individual performance, and then you're asking them to do this peer 360 thing, it's often weaponized, or, you know, there's a like bad culture around it where we're not giving the feedback that we need to regularly. And so I'm just going to put it in here because, you know, that's what I do. That doesn't work. But if the goal is aligned, right, for a shared team outcome where everyone, you know, it is everyone's individual performance matters to that goal, then their feedback to each other does matter. So in that instance, I think it can really work. I actually just heard of a company, a big company everyone on this call would know, where their compensation, they have a salary and their entire like variable compensation is decided on peer review. So they decide themselves who gets the raise, which is really.
How did when I'm interested when you heard that, like what happened inside the head, the stomach, maybe, like what happened there?
Yeah, you know, for me as a employee, right, I'm like, oh God, like, you know, this feels, you know, it feels scary or risky, or, you know, I don't know. But as a leader, wow, what a powerful tool. Because if I'm helping my team, if this mechanism is helping my team work together better and figure it out together, then it makes sense, right? So it's good and bad. It's gotta be really well coached, though, I would say.
Yeah. I'm visualizing like these political campaigns that resemble like high school, um, uh, uh, student government type of races of people just, walking around trying to be nice to everybody to get votes, right? It's like, put the ticket in my bucket,
Yeah.
so I can get a raise.
Please vote for me.
Um,
Yeah.
and David and Emily mentioned something that's interesting too here, and I think what we're talking about is like there's an assumption that goals have been established, that there has been clear expectation setting. I feel like, and I think I made this up. I definitely made it up. But I have this feeling like 99% of all disagreements come from misaligned expectations. How do you think about, like, when you're talking about all these ideas and things that managers can go do? Where does the expectation actually fit in when you're coaching or people are working with your tool? Like, how does that unfold?
Like, how do they create the expectation, basically?
Yeah, if we need to start there, right?
Yeah.
How does that conversation typically get started and unfold as it relates to ultimately coming back to those things to measure against in a performance review?
Look, I'm a big fan of asking open-ended questions. That's like the beginning of coaching, or the most fundamental thing of coaching, I think, is like, well, you know, as a coach, you want to understand, where is this person's understanding of the expectation? Where are they holding themselves to, right? Like, getting as much information as you can about the understanding of how aligned or misaligned you are is really important. So I would start with asking open-ended questions. I would personally, I'm of the, and I think it depends, but particularly if you're leading professionals, right? Anyone, call it 2 or 3 years out of school, maybe, and even early people, right? If you draw them into the expectation creation process, it usually does better. There's research that shows that when employees create their own goals, they set them higher and have a higher achievement against them than if they are set for them. So you think about it like, hey, I'm the manager, I'm going to set the bar here. And, you know, I might expect this much performance, right? But if the employees are doing it, they're going to set the bar here and they're actually going to achieve this level of performance, right? So you want to draw them into the expectation process. And that's you're both creating the third thing together. You're both creating the problem. So that's the start of it. As you go through, right, as you continuously do this, I'm a big fan of the GROW model for coaching. I don't know if you've ever talked about it on here before. It stands for goal, reality, options, will. So basically, you're both aligned on the goal. It could be goal or problem, sort of like, what's this thing we needed to do? Reality is, hey, tell me, if I'm coaching you, I'm like, tell me everything about where we're at with this. What is the current reality of the situation? Okay, great. Is there anyone else that, has a blind spot, or do you have blind spots to the reality? Because I, as your manager, will go figure out who in the organization knows about that thing and can do this thing, right? Like, so you want to know what's the current reality, and is there anything we don't know? Because we got to go figure that out. And then the next question is options. Okay, this is the goal or the problem. How are we going to solve this? What are the different options that we can go do together to create a solution for this thing? Sometimes, a lot of the times, employees, and this is where expectations can get funky, is they just don't know an option, or they don't think an option is possible, when you as the manager know, yeah, that's the simplest solution. We should just do that. It costs $100. Do it. It's $100, like whatever the case may be. So the options, the question I really like to use for that is, what is, if you could wave a magic wand, Joe, how would you solve this thing? And it kind of gets them out of the constraints to be a little bit more creative about how to achieve that goal or solve that problem. And then will is really, this is where you put it back on the employee and say, all right, what are you going to do about it now? Right? What are and usually they've so engaged in this process.
They're already gone. They're already running and getting it done. Right.
Yeah, they're already doing it.
Looking at my partner Elijah over here, who likes to do that kind of stuff in the middle of meetings. And it's like, we're talking about website update, and
he's already done it.
We don't. Yeah, it's done. It's like, oh, we didn't even talk about the G, the R. We talked about the G, not the R, the O, but it's done.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. I want to hit real quick. Matt Trotsky has and he, my self-proclaimed, or the self-proclaimed setup man, Justin setup man here. How does Opre calibrate for personal ebb and flow of performance due to such things as someone grieving? Let's say any hardship. Let's say anything going on in somebody's life. Spousal job loss, financial hardship, divorce, like relationship stress, like whatever it is. How does Opre calibrate for that?
It does for that. Well, look, at first it's just like we need to be talking about performance every day. We need to be talking about us as humans. Like, we are human people. I'm a big fan of starting a one-on-one to say, hey, how are you? How's it going? And sometimes they'll say that, I might know that they're going through something, but they don't want to talk about it that day. So they just dive right into the work, and that's okay. Right. So the adaptation is really how Opre adjusts for it, right, is to say, hey, like, Justin, if let's say one day, let's say I'm grieving someone, but I'm back at work and I'm trying to like get into the groove again. I might not want to talk about it the day you asked me about it. But Opre is going to continuously remind you to ask about it. And not maybe in a direct way, but in a, you might assume, let's say you assume that because I didn't want to talk about it that day, then you don't ask, right? Opre will recognize the fact that you're not asking, and it'll say, hey, are you sure you might want to check in with Kate about this thing that she's grieving? We noticed you haven't talked about it in a long time. So essentially what it's doing for anything is to say, hey, here's the things you talk about, and here's what we know you haven't talked about in a long time. And here are things that you've never talked about that maybe you should. So it's categorizing conversations that way. The you've never talked about it, like, let's say you've never talked about a raise, right? We might say, hey, Justin's been here for 14 months. You've not ever had a conversation about compensation. You may want to have that conversation now. So it's looking for conversations that we know are important to have that you haven't had. And then it's reminding you of conversations. Like, let's say you did talk about a promotion 6 months ago and you haven't talked about it since,
Mhm.
Opry will say, hey, you may want to check in about this. And grief is one of those things, right? And
Mhm.
it is hard. I'm not going to pretend that we get it right, because we don't.
Mhm.
It takes a human to really understand how this person is doing,
Mhm.
and to listen to what the
Mhm.
preferences are of the person going through the grief.
Yeah. Yeah. So Opry will help remind you of those things, but it still takes that human layer. And to David's point, probably a base foundation of the skill of empathy to be able to deliver those conversations.
Yeah, that is. It does all come back to empathy, David.
Yeah. I wanted to go, we're not going to have time, but I wanted to go a little bit deeper into performance improvement plans, PIPs, because people love talking about them because there are some horror stories and
Yeah.
all sorts of opinions. But I have a specific PIP related question that I would love your take on, because it relates to bereave and some conversations that we have actually gotten calls about this year, and we've been called probably 3 times in very related situations where employees who have suffered a close loss in their lives were either on a PIP during that loss, or there was an upcoming PIP to be delivered that may actually have been a surprise coming to that person. And the HR managers were really looking to talk through how to pursue these situations and coming to us from like a bereavement perspective. And of course, I've got my own thoughts here, so which I'll reserve, but curious how you think about situations where there are performance issues and hardship, and like how to walk that line and how to balance those scenarios.
Thanks. Well, look, I'm not going to pretend to be the expert on this. I think I would love to hear your thoughts on it. My initial gut reaction is really based on my experience, which we've talked about offline, but like in call it a 4-year period, I had 2 young people diagnosed with terminal cancer. I had 2 other employees have health issues that caused them to go blind. In computer work, that's really hard, right? These things are hard. Like, how you approach them is a really hard thing. And I would say when it comes to performance, I shouldn't say it. I think it comes down to, what do you as a human want to be true about how you handled this situation?
Sure.
I mean, that at the end of the day, that's what I care most about, is when I sit down on the pillow or lay down on the pillow. I don't sit on the pillow. When I lay my head on the pillow.
Whatever. I'm cracking.
How did I feel about handling the situation?
Mhm.
And I think fairness matters. I think, treating others the way you want to be treated really matters. And yeah, it's a really hard situation. I tend to think, sometimes the cookie's going to crumble the way it's going to crumble. And that's true for us as humans going through grief, like things we didn't expect. It happened to us. And those things also happen to a company. And you have to just be prepared monetarily, like do what you can to be prepared for those situations, and you can't change it, right? So I think there's some, things that companies can do to help a manager navigate this situation. And you do the best you can. You need to be really, like, I don't think you can fully policy this. You need to have an individual, like, yes, there are some, I want to learn more about it, bereavement policies that need to happen. But I think that there's also a individual understanding of a situation that needs to happen. And for managers, like, I'll say this, one of the people who I led, who was diagnosed with cancer, she unfortunately passed away. One of her direct reports was really struggling through this time. She, lacked direction. Like, this person who's going through cancer treatment was not the best manager at that time. But, you know, I wanted to make sure that this person had health care. I wanted to make sure that this person, was in the best possible situation to take the best care of herself, from a health perspective. And I would help, anything that she needed to have done from a work perspective. I would, I'm like, hey, just put me in, coach.
Right.
You tell me what you need from me. And she did. And there were times, when you really build trust with someone, I think that they can call you, and you have like sort of a service-based approach to management and leadership. Your direct report will call you when they need help, regardless of what they're going through. And, her direct report, there were times where I was like, hey, I know that this is a situation. I'm asking for a lot from this team and it's going through a lot. So you call me and I just check in, right? I just check in with her direct reports on a more frequent basis, just to like, hey, how you doing with this?
Right.
I know it's hard to have a boss who's not present, or, and to still be expected to meet certain expectations. But you just kind of have to go through. It's the way the cookie crumbled. You have to go through it.
Yeah, totally. Thank you for that. I think, in a very similar capacity, right? Like those situations to me weren't bereavement situations, right?
Yes, you're right.
Those were relationship situations. Those were employer brand situations. Those were retention situations, not for that person necessarily, but for everybody else who's watching how they handled those situations, right? Because it could be you one day. And that says a lot about who you are. And I think sometimes we get caught up in like, the thing that's happening versus like taking a step back and looking at the entire ripple effect, not just on people, but on a business or on customers or on partners, and really understanding the kind of the whole environment there. Last thing, if because performance reviews can be such a contentious topic, if you, as somebody who is living it every day, has one message to leaders about the importance of performance reviews, what would you tell them that you think might be news to them?
Your team makes you a leader. You don't make yourself a leader, right? It's how your team follows you and connects with you that makes you the leader. And so performance reviews, right, are somewhat a self-reflection, right? Yes. Am I helping Joe perform better? Absolutely. But in some way, right, the way that you lead a team and the success that that group has together is a reflection of your work. It's how you get the feedback of the job of management and leadership. And so to be, to avoid these conversations, right, and to not have them is also not fair to you as the leader. Right? It's the only way that you get better, when you help others to meet the expectation, to, when you are building trust with them, when you're connecting with them and coaching them, right? That's how it's your performance review too, I guess, is the news that we kind of forget, because we are constantly in the value, when we're in like a traditional approach to performance management, it's like, I got to evaluate this person, right? And we lose the responsibility we have in it sometimes. And that's, I think that's the news.
Yeah, I know. I love it. I love it. Just thinking about that, like the way you said that it's your performance review too. I'm thinking about reflecting on, if you're giving 6 or 7 or 8 performance reviews and you walk away from that, the question that you have to ask is, what do those reviews say about me and the way I'm managing people and the way I'm leading? Right.
Yeah.
And that could be that mindset shift could be a pretty big unlock to how you show up the next day.
That's it. So we actually separate these things out so that, to make the point very clear, you get performance reviews from Opre, but you also get what we call manager success insights. We say, like, we look at of the skills of management and leadership, right? How did I apply them with Justin and Joe and David and Emily and Sue, right? You can see through Opre basically, like, I did coaching really well with these people, but not with these. They deserve this this skill from me, right? And then you can also see, like, for me personally, I am horrible at career pathing, apparently. I didn't know this until I started using our own tool, because
Right.
it's a consistent theme with every one of my direct reports.
Yeah.
And so like, oh, fuck, I
Yeah. That's all
shouldn't
right.
swear, but
That's all right. We're good. We're
I
good.
need,
We're good.
I need to get better at this. Hopefully you can edit that out.
No edits. We go straight for the jugular on it. No, this is awesome. Thank you so much, Kate, for being here. I feel like this is something that I don't feel like I've ever gotten right. A little bit closer to right as my career progressed, but a lot of room personally. So I take a lot of personal gratitude and for you sharing today. But also I feel like I could geek out on this stuff for hours, maybe days. Who knows?
I'm game. Look, one last thing is, leaders, we put so much pressure on ourselves. We need to be empathetic and kind to ourselves, because it is a hard job, and it's a lonely job. And so I would love to geek out with you,
great.
and just remember to be kind.
Be kind to yourself. Totally get it. Whether you knew it or not, Kate, this was the last Loss Leaders of 2025. So you're going to take us into, or I'm sorry, of 2024, and you're going to take us into 2025. We're darn close to having completed 30 episodes. I think you're number 29, maybe, if I'm thinking about this right. We are going to continue this. When we started this a year ago, and actually Thursday is our 1-year anniversary of Loss Leaders. So you're as close to the anniversary as we can get. When we started this, we thought we would do it weekly. Then we thought we'd do it monthly. And we found out that we found a rhythm in every 2 weeks. So we are going to continue that in 2025. We've already got just a great lineup started to be scheduled for next year. For those of you who are here for the first time, thank you. We'll continue to do this. We're going to talk about things grief related. We're going to talk things about death related. We're going to talk about uncomfortable things, but we'll also talk about culture. We'll also talk about building companies. We'll also talk about HR related things, management related things, all the things that it takes to show up for your employees when they need it most. So we'll continue to do that. Kate, thank you so much. Everybody else, thank you so much for your support. Matt Trotsky, you've been to everyone or darn close. So thank you so much for being here, Matt. And thanks for your ongoing support and engagement. Everybody else, happy holidays, happy new year, and we'll see you in 2025.
Bye, all.